Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
The huge forest was quiet and peaceful. Somewhere in the distance, birds were singing. The crunching of branches could be heard. Someone was clearly walking down the path. Voices could be heard echoing throughout the forest. There were clearly two people talking. Quietly, then loudly, then laughing. The voices came from a distance, but grew louder and more distinct. The man in front was unusually large and imposing, carrying on his shoulders a young deer, which he considered his own prey, and his friend, who walked beside him, carried his rifles. Everything went well this time. "Oh, by golly, I went hunting yesterday. I thought it was going to be a disaster," Eric said, smiling slightly. He tossed the carcass on his shoulders and again his face lit up with a smile. "The fool flew out on his own. All I had time to do was raise my gun. It came right at me. Not something to be proud of, but it's better than nothing." "Oh, come on. Look how beautiful she is," said the friend, involuntarily stroking the animal's neck. "We should take it to Albert. Let him skin it and take the meat for himself. I want boots, real ones, so that I can go into the woods in winter," Eric said with genuine pride. They walked farther, and the branches still crunched beneath them. Autumn was just coming, and in some places the golden leaves were just peeking through. Eric loved this time of year, for while nature was already beginning to fall asleep, but the hunters couldn't be seen behind all the thick foliage. When the trees came off, they would have to make a lot of effort to camouflage themselves, otherwise the beasts would see them from afar. And Eric himself wanted to go on a real wild boar chase this winter. Hunting was his passion, his main love, and his only endeavor to get out of the house or get away from work. Lately his whole life had revolved around hunting, around his newborn son. Everything else just stopped mattering, including his spouse, who clearly didn't approve. "Here now we will bring and give, although the most delicious will also take away. I'll cook venison at home, so we'll have an excuse to sit down for wine tonight," Eric said. "It's been so long since we've seen each other. How are you doing?" "I just got here, and you're taking me hunting," Dylan said, threatening me with his index finger. "Yeah, I did. I already agreed to go hunting. I hope the local kids didn't tear our cars apart. It's weird, we've had so many people go into the woods, and I'm the only one coming out." "Well, we're the only ones coming out. Well, maybe not everyone is as lucky as I am," Eric said. Only now he remembered that his friend was asking him how he was doing. Eric, as if he wasn't going to answer, just shrugged. "Do you think everything is completely lost?" Dylan asked, as if realizing what his friend was talking about. Dylan had known Eric for too long, and he knew that if he spoke with such confidence, such happiness about hunting, he was probably in a lot of trouble in other areas of his life. Eric had a lucrative job, an earned reputation. He was a respected man, a businessman. He seemed to have everything one could dream of, albeit without frills. Yes, he could afford to vacation in expensive resorts, but he didn't want to. Lately, the older he got, the less money he spent on himself and his family. "I don't know, we've grown very distant from each other lately. I feel like it's only going to get worse from here on out. It's like it's all screwed up, you know? I mean, we didn't really have this intense love and emotion to begin with, but I didn't leave her. When I found out she was pregnant, I immediately cut off the oxygen everywhere because I realized that her peace of mind now is much more important than my temporary desires. And in response, after she gave birth to a child, I heard only reproaches. It's all been building up like a snowball, and now it's turned into a nightmare," Eric said. "I don't know, maybe you should just exhale a little bit. Seriously, maybe just be alone with yourself for a little while. Go somewhere, exhale. Maybe you'll come up with a good idea. I know what I'm talking about. I've been married myself. I ruined my relationship, and believe me, I still regret it. I look at my daughters and I think what an idiot I was to let my wife go with them. They got a new daddy, a new life, and I'm on the sidelines. I only have time to send money," Dylan said. Eric nodded. He was afraid he was going to be just a Sunday dad. He was worried and didn't know how to turn the situation to his advantage. He knew his wife could just walk away. She will still find a suitable man, and he will then bite his elbows. He wouldn't grieve over the loss of his wife, but he would really struggle if his son was taken away from him. After all that he had endured after the endless work, he wanted only one thing, to have a family waiting for him at home. And now there was a disgruntled woman, a crying child, and constant reproaches from the outside waiting for him at home. And what is he doing wrong? I don't know, I'm confused. I'm a grown man, I can break someone's neck in one fell swoop. But I can't handle myself. The problems in the family are piling up like a snowball. Eric said and shook his head negatively. They came out of the woods, and the evening sun was hitting their eyes. Eric covered his face with the palm of his hand. When his eyes got a little used to the bright light, he involuntarily looked back towards the forest, where he thought it was nice and calm. It was only in the woods while hunting that he felt in his place. He has some amazing feeling inside, as if he could turn mountains if he energized himself here. And now he had to leave this place and go back to the city, back to all the hustle and bustle. Negotiations, work issues, claims of his wife would start again, and there was no end to this nightmare. Eric threw the carcass in, secured it. He made sure they had everything with them, put the guns away. And then when everything was ready, he got behind the wheel, his friend got in the passenger seat, and it was time to leave. Eric was still standing there. His car, with its nose against the spruce trunks, came to a standstill. Do you think it's possible to fix anything? Maybe I got married early? Maybe I didn't need all this? Everyone around me said I needed a family, that I should have it all, but I don't get any joy out of it. Work, hunting, traveling. That's where I feel at least a little man, and at home I have to be some kind of fashion, to watch how the child cries and how my wife complains that she always lacks something. That money is not enough or attention. She can't make up her mind, Eric said. Eric, you'll regret it if you leave your family. If you're anything like me, you'll regret it. You cannot, you have already made a child, and the child is not guilty of anything. Look at you, you grew up without a father. Did you have fun? I grew up without a father too, and I don't want my kids to go through that, Dylan said. I know you have to think about the baby now, but is there really no other way? Let her go away, do her own thing, make her own business like she's always wanted to, and I'll keep the baby. What's wrong with that? Eric asked. Because she's Eric's mother, and no court will take your side. She may be weird, but she's still a mother. You can't prove she's a bad mother because there's nothing to prove. I don't know what to tell you. Why don't you just let it go for a little while? Just let it go, You'll feel better in a little while. You'll see, Dylan said. Eric listened to him as if in one ear. It was strange. Very rarely did he talk to his friend about personal relationships. They were usually about hobbies, about work, about money, and not at all about what he was so concerned about right now. Maybe you're right. Maybe we should wait a little longer, Eric said. I'm just not sure I can wait long enough. He backed up, turned the car abruptly on the broken road, and drove toward the busy highway. There was tall, low, noisy grass on either side. It was already drinking heavily. Autumn was slowly taking hold. Dylan opened the window, stretched out his arm. His palm passed just over the top of that tall grass. He understood his friend perfectly well, and he also realized that his situation was almost hopeless, and it was extremely difficult to advise him. At one time, he had thought he was doing the right thing in leaving his spouse and breaking into a new life. But after a while, if he could take it all back, he would never do that. Right now, he was afraid Eric would do the wrong thing. He would just pick himself his hobby. But months would pass, and his son would prove to be far more important. He'll help him, of course. They'll visit, but raising a child and just visiting, bringing money, playing, they're completely different things. Now Dylan understood that, but he didn't know how to convey it to his friend, who didn't even realize how difficult it would be for him. Okay, whatever happens, happens. I haven't really been thinking about it lately. I feel like it's time for a change. Either change myself or change my environment. Either way, I'm not in the best moral shape right now, Eric said. I'm not stupid either. I realize that I'm literally running away from family problems when I'm hunting and working. I'm ashamed to admit that I can't solve the simplest things. God, I've built such a huge business from scratch, and I can't solve my wife's problems. You could see on Eric's face that even those words hurt him. Clearly, he did not want to start this conversation again, but it was extremely difficult to stay alone with these thoughts. They drove in complete silence for a while. Eric was focused on the road. His friend was listening to music, watching the cars go by. They both realized that they were trapped in their lives. They also realized there was nothing they could do about it. Eric thought about what he would do about his wife, about his family, what he would do when he got home and when his relationship became an unbearable burden. His wife is calling, Eric said when he heard the phone vibrate. He reached for the receiver, dropping the call. Dylan looked at him in surprise, but there was understanding in his gaze, too. Eric hurriedly excused himself. I don't want to talk to her. Now she's going to start saying that I left without her permission. How can I be sick of this? Eric dropped another call, then another. He turned off the phone, putting it back down. Eric took the steering wheel in both hands again. Dylan, who was already looking at the road, felt out of place. It had been too long since they had talked, apparently, and the emotional closeness they used to have was no longer there. They were both realized in their respective spheres. But who would have thought it would get worse? There were other areas of life besides work that they were establishing with difficulty. Dylan patted his friend on the shoulder to support him a little, and he was grateful for it. I know how this looks from the outside. I'm a grown man who can't solve his own problems. But I'm tired, Eric said. Dylan understood him. As they drove into town, he felt lighter. Despite the fact that when they were young, they went hunting very often. As Dylan got older, he lost interest in it, but he wanted to be near his friend so badly that he had agreed to any hunting trip, even though now he felt he had agreed to it for nothing, just to please someone else. Well, thank you. I know you don't feel the same way about all this as you used to, Eric said when they pulled up outside Dylan's house. Dylan nodded. He already knew that his behavior was obvious. He just didn't want to hurt Eric, but he also didn't want to get involved in all this carnage. Hunting wasn't really his thing anymore. Maybe not yet, or maybe he'd never go back to his former excitement again. They said their goodbyes. Eric turned the car around and drove home. He drove through the city at night and thought that he would give too much right now to not have all these huge buildings here. It would be better to have beautiful mountains here, plains. It was very hard for him to live in the city, and he'd always wanted to move somewhere closer to nature. Eric turned towards a cottage village, which was a kilometer away from the city. Here he already drove through the gates closed from outsiders. He waved to the security guard. Eric drove into the courtyard. He had no mood. He wanted nothing. There was only one desire: to park the car and just leave everything as it was. What else could he do? Nothing. Nothing he could do about his life. At least for now. The wife would have to be tolerated. Good thing things were going well at work. But Eric suddenly sensed something was wrong. The first thing he heard was his wife crying. Eric ran out of his seat and into the house. He saw his wife lying on the floor sobbing. She was cradling a child's toy, and the man's first thoughts were decidedly creepy. He knew dozens of stories of depressed moms getting rid of their children, and now suddenly this picture suddenly popped into his head. Grace was the ultimate weirdo, especially lately, so he wouldn't be surprised by anything. He leaned over, took her by the shoulders, and shook her like an old sheet. She looked up at him with completely blank, crying eyes. They took him away. They took his son, broke in, shot him, took him away. She sobbed. It was only now that Eric began to realize what was happening. He threw his wife onto the couch. She slid down it again onto the floor. The woman was flooding with tears and could no longer prevent the wave of emotions. Eric began to walk around the room, quickly dialed a phone number, began to call an acquaintance who could contribute to the search. He quickly told the whole story. He'd gotten everyone he could think of on the line. And now all he could look at was Grace, who was finally starting to calm down. How could they have gotten in here? Where are the guards? Eric said fiercely. He clearly wasn't going to let this situation go and wanted to get at the truth. She was sobbing. He grabbed her by the shoulders again, shook her, started threatening to put her under an ice-cold shower if she didn't tell everything. They fought there, standing there arguing right outside the gate. And I had a headache. The baby was crying all the time. I kicked them out because they bored me, told them they could come tomorrow, but today so I wouldn't see anyone. Look at the neighborhood we live in. Why is there even security here? Grace screamed. You idiot. Now look at the situation we have here. Happy? Well, at least now you'll be out of the way. I told you never to remove the guards under any circumstances. You should have told them to hear and listen only to me a long time ago, Eric said. You grabbed the phone when someone called him. Eric ran outside to talk on the phone. He was shaking all over. Eric didn't understand how he could lose his son overnight, and who would even need to come here to take away an innocent child. Eric realized it was probably work-related, but he couldn't help himself. He was sure it was all his wife's fault for not thinking with her head in time. When he entered the living room again, she was no longer there. Streams of water could be heard. Most likely, she wanted to bait to calm down a bit. All that was left was to wait. He couldn't go to the police, because that might lead to some of his competitors. Eric didn't want to just lock up the people who stole his son. He would give them a real execution, especially if they couldn't find the kid alive. It even pained Eric to even think of such a thing being possible. Someone had taken the baby for ransom, and now he had to keep his cell phone on. What if they called, asking for ransom, and he didn't hear? Eric walked all over the house, waiting for the call, but not after an hour, not after 2 calls did not come. He had to sit and wait for the thieves to show up someday. Eric woke up in his chair. He didn't remember falling asleep. He had a terrible headache from everything he had been through and from the endless amount of nerves. His wife was asleep upstairs. The usual crying of the baby could not be heard. Eric picked up the phone, but there was not a single call. He didn't know what to do next. He should go to the police. Came his wife's voice from the back. Eric turned to her, and he suddenly wanted to pull her hair. She'd finally realized what a stupid thing she'd done. She looked miserable, broken, and of course, in his head, he knew perfectly well that she had just made a mistake and regretted it very bitterly herself. But he couldn't bring himself to forgive her for taking away their protection herself. What if it had just been some kind of carnage? What if he'd arrived and found only pools of liquid here, or even seeing his much-loved home going up in flames from afar? Do you realize what kind of a wild thing you've done? He asked, without even turning to his wife. I immediately started calling you in case something could fix it, and you did not pick up the phone. Then even turned off the phone. You can't do that, she said nervously. Yes. And how can you, knowing perfectly well what kind of person I am, just stay unprotected? That's a good one. That's a good idea. Who else would do such a thing? God, I hate you right now, he said. She didn't say anything more to him. She felt as if she were falling to pieces. Her head hurt so badly. Somewhere inside it was gnawing. Guilt seemed to be written all over her face, but he didn't believe her. Apparently this was an excuse for him to destroy this relationship for good. You never loved me at all. All you wanted was a child, and I just got caught in the middle of it, she said unhappily. Stupid. Our baby was stolen from us, and you decided to make it all my fault. I didn't want a baby. I never wanted kids. But when he was born, I loved him right away. I wanted us to have a family, but you've turned into some strange creature who whines all the time. You cry and complain, and you don't do a damn thing. You've got nannies, you've got money, you can go anywhere at any time. What did you do? I just got rid of the guards. And maybe because of you, our son is no longer alive. Eric screamed. He shouted so loud it sounded like glass breaking. He realized that it was useless to scream now. From his own screaming, his head was bursting, but he could not stop because the emotions bred become over the edge. His head was buzzing. Everything around him was turning inside out. Did you do all this yourself? Believe me, if I find out that our baby didn't survive, you'll be the first thing I'll get off on, Eric shouted. The phone rang. Eric, without wasting a second, immediately put the phone to his ear. He heard a familiar voice. He flew outside so that no one and nothing could prevent him from hearing the person he was talking to. But when he heard hints of who might be responsible for what had happened, he felt uneasy. Somewhere inside, a pane of glass shattered. The pain was such that it was simply impossible to bear. He felt the guilt of his own inattention, of his own poor choice of surroundings getting to him. He promised that he would stop by during the day, but in the meantime, he asked her to send him all the information she had, so that maybe everything inside had collapsed. And when Eric came indoors again, he said nothing to his wife, looked at her tiredly, and went to take a shower to clean himself up, and already go to find out what to do next and how to find the culprits on whom the shadow of doubt was already falling. The fall morning was calm and quiet. Nothing heralded trouble. The janitor, Charlie, who was back on duty, looked around. He had a strange feeling, as if today, something was bound to happen. There hadn't been any problems at work lately. He dispersed all the unlikeliest inhabitants of the yard pretty quickly and kept the yard itself clean. Charlie, despite the fact that his position could not be called high and prestigious, was very responsible for his work. He enjoyed doing all this. Of course, after all the work he had done when he was young, janitorial work seemed less prestigious. But in his old age, especially with the kind of illness he had, there wasn't much to choose between jobs. and here everything was literally close to home. And the locals respected him. Nobody even laughed at him. "Charlie, you're up at the crack of dawn, as usual," said another janitor, shaking his hand firmly. "I can't sleep, I can't help it. I have to be out in half an hour anyway. What's the use of stalling? I'll get the job done before I go home," said the janitor with a smile. "That's also true. Well, I'm off to my site. If you do anything, call me. You had a company sitting there yesterday, so there will probably be plenty of cleaning. It's right behind the park," said the coworker, pointing with his palm to a small square that was part of the yard. Charlie looked in that direction. He had a rather strange feeling, as if something would really happen and he would have to be responsible for it. He was upset when he heard that some company had left piles of trash there. He tried to keep it clean, and it upset him when some vandals neglected his work. Charlie walked that way, slung his broom on his shoulder. There was almost no one on the street. Only occasionally someone passed by. Now a woman in a thin jacket walked by, muttering something to herself. Charlie paid no attention to her, but suddenly he heard a strange sound. Someone was squeaking, whimpering. Charlie listened carefully. His age was not the same, and his hearing was not the same either. And when he saw a moving trash bag with a surprise, he was very upset. "Perverts. But if you don't want kittens, drown them. Since you're such freaks, you can't sterilize a cat. So now let's stuff kittens in bags and throw them away. What's the humane thing to do if they suffocate alive in there?" asked the man to the void. The janitor took hold of the bench with one hand, bent down and looked under the bench. He pulled a sack out of there, but when he opened it, he was just stunned. In front of him was an infant who was lurching, crying, and probably barely breathing here by now. As soon as the bag was opened, the baby, as if realizing that it was freedom, began to breathe deeply and intermittently. The janitor dropped the broom, jerked back. He shuddered at the mere thought that someone had taken a baby and left it here. How was that even possible? With trembling hands, the man dialed the phone number, called the police, explained the situation. Not only the police, but also an ambulance came to the call. A tall, thin woman got out of the ambulance, approached the child, began to examine him. The janitor, who was watching all this, already realized that very quickly the information would spread that the child was found in a black bag under the bench. Clearly, the news is shocking the citizens of the city. "Give me your number," said the police officer, taking notes. The old man dictated the number to him. "If I call you, please be in touch. I will still need your testimony." "Will he live?" the janitor asked, looking at the woman who was holding a baby in her arms. "She will, thanks to you she will," said the woman, smiling at him. When the janitor finished his work, he went back to the office and everyone there knew what had happened. It turns out that someone at the hospital or at the police station had posted the news of what had happened, and it instantly spread on social media. The news that a local janitor discovered a trash bag under a bench with a surprise under it shocked the residents of the town. "It must be that child," said an old friend and colleague who was sitting in front of the TV. "What baby?" asked Charlie. Charlie didn't watch TV at all, so he was not aware of what was going on. And he was often left out of the news. He was no longer surprised when he didn't know something or when he was not aware of what was going on. "My daughter told me yesterday that it was posted on the internet that a child had been taken away from a local businessman," the man said, scratching the back of his head. "Just like that?" Charlie asked in surprise. "Why?" "The hell with rich people. They're all so good. They all live by their own rules. To them we are the fools, the beggars. Maybe they wanted a ransom. Or maybe they wanted whatever the hell else they wanted. I don't know. Maybe there was no truth to the news at all. My daughter says that not everything on the internet is true," the colleague said and then shrugged, as if to show that he didn't approve of all these new technologies. Charlie went home after work and kept replaying in his head all the situations that had happened today. He kept thinking about the fact that someone's child was in a bag, and that child might have a mom and dad who were grieving right now, realizing that their baby might not be alive anymore. Only Charlie himself, learning of this, could help the unfortunate child. But what if he hadn't been tormented by insomnia today? What if he had woken up on time today? Then the baby just wouldn't have survived there. There would have been a whole other surprise in the bag. A much sadder one than the one discovered this morning. Charlie entered the apartment, sat down at the table, turned on the TV finally to see what was going on. But there was no news about the baby or the businessman who was supposedly without a son. Charlie looked in that direction. He had a rather strange feeling, as if something would really happen and he would have to be responsible for it. He was upset when he heard that some company had left piles of trash there. He tried to keep it clean, and it upset him when some vandals neglected his work. Charlie walked that way, slung his broom on his shoulder. There was almost no one on the street. Only occasionally someone passed by. Now a woman in a thin jacket walked by, muttering something to herself. Charlie paid no attention to her, but suddenly he heard a strange sound. Someone was squeaking, whimpering. Charlie listened carefully. His age was not the same, and his hearing was not the same either. And when he saw moving trash bag with a surprise, he was very upset. Perverts. But if you don't want kittens, drown them. Since you're such freaks, you can't sterilize a cat. So now let's stuff kittens in bags and throw them away. What's the humane thing to do if they suffocate alive in there? Asked the man to the void. The janitor took hold of the bench with one hand, bent down and looked under the bench. He pulled a sack out of there, but when he opened it, he was just stunned. In front of him was an infant who was lurching, crying, and probably barely breathing here by now. As soon as the bag was opened, the baby, as if realizing that it was freedom, began to breathe deeply and intermittently. The janitor dropped the broom, jerked back. He shuddered at the mere thought that someone had taken a baby and left it here. How was that even possible? With trembling hands, the man dialed the phone number, called the police, explained the situation. Not only the police, but also an ambulance came to the call. A tall, thin woman got out of the ambulance, approached the child, began to examine him. The janitor, who was watching all this, already realized that very quickly the information would spread that the child was found in a black bag under the bench. Clearly, the news is shocking the citizens of the city. "Give me your number," said the police officer, taking notes. The old man dictated the number to him. "If I call you, please be in touch. I will still need your testimony." "Will he live?" the janitor asked, looking at the woman who was holding a baby in her arms. "She will, thanks to you, she will," said the woman, smiling at him. When the janitor finished his work, he went back to the office and everyone there knew what had happened. It turns out that someone at the hospital or at the police station had posted the news of what had happened, and it instantly spread on social media. The news that a local janitor discovered a trash bag under a bench with a surprise under it shocked the residents of the town. "It must be that child," said an old friend and colleague who was sitting in front of the TV. "What baby?" asked Charlie. Charlie didn't watch TV at all, so he was not aware of what was going on. And he was often left out of the news. He was no longer surprised when he didn't know something or when he was not aware of what was going on. "My daughter told me yesterday that it was posted on the internet that a child had been taken away from a local businessman," the man said, scratching the back of his head. "Just like that?" Charlie asked in surprise. "Why?" "The hell with rich people. They're all so good. They all live by their own rules. To them we are the fools, the beggars. Maybe they wanted a ransom, or maybe they wanted whatever the hell else they wanted. I don't know. Maybe there was no truth to the news at all. My daughter says that not everything on the internet is true," the colleague said and then shrugged, as if to show that he didn't approve of all these new technologies. Charlie went home after work and kept replaying in his head all the situations that had happened today. He kept thinking about the fact that someone's child was in a bag, and that child might have a mom and dad who were grieving right now, realizing that their baby might not be alive anymore. Only Charlie himself, learning of this, could help the unfortunate child. But what if he hadn't been tormented by insomnia today? What if he had woken up on time today? Then the baby just wouldn't have survived there. There would have been a whole other surprise in the bag, a much sadder one than the one discovered this morning. Charlie entered the apartment, sat down at the table, turned on the TV finally to see what was going on. But there was no news about the baby or the businessman who was supposedly without a son. When the door clicked and Chris walked into the apartment, Charlie jumped. He was terribly happy to see his son. But now his son's arrival was also necessary. "Dad, why did the locals say that you found the baby?" Chris asked in surprise. And his father immediately nodded. "Yes, I am already old. Always trouble sleeping. I couldn't sleep all night. I got up this morning. I realized I can't, so I went out an hour early and found it in a bag. God, I can't even imagine what's possible. But I need your help, Chris. See, here's the thing. I don't know about all this technology myself. A guy I know told me this kid was stolen from a big businessman. Do you think it's Eric's son?" asked Chris, who was obviously more aware of the situation than his father. I don't know. I can't tell you that right off the bat. Maybe it's Eric's. Maybe you could call him, let him know. I mean, think about it. He's just a little baby, and he's got no one right now. Maybe his parents are freaking out over there, and we know, but we haven't told them. Charlie asked. The son nodded. He immediately sat down, started looking for a phone number, but only found the number of the company that belonged to Eric. He dialed the phone number, got to the front desk, and explained the situation. And he was immediately notified that he would get a call. When he got a call back, he immediately relayed the information. The man who listened to him on the other end of the phone apparently took notes, thanked him, asked for his first and last name, then disconnected. Maybe it really is his kid. Oh my God, what's happening? Babies get stolen, innocent little ones get hurt. Why all of a sudden? Because the parents can't agree on something. Mark my word, Dad, the closest ones will be to blame, the man said. The hell they are. My friend said it right, you can't tell them rich people. Maybe the child was stolen only for ransom and not getting the money, decided to just get rid of him. I think that's exactly what happened. Well, thank you for coming. Sit down, at least we'll have a decent meal. We can talk about something else. I've got a lot on my mind today, said Charlie. He listened to his son talk about his work, but he kept thinking about the baby. He couldn't believe that someone could just throw away a live baby in a garbage bag and let it suffocate to death. He couldn't believe that someone was so filled with cruelty that they would do such a thing. Charlie believed that such people should not be kept even close to the rest of us, for they were not human. Even animals don't do that to their babies, but people would go to such lengths. I still don't know. I feel like it's just some other person's baby. Remember, there was a report on TV when a woman gave birth in the bathtub and just threw the baby in a gym bag into the street. Could that be the case here too? Chris asked. Whatever were they talking about? Still, their conversation kept coming back to the subject of the baby. The janitor, who heard and listened to his son, understood why he had such a strange, genuine interest in all this. In their city in general, such things happened very rarely and therefore caused a terrible resonance. People were literally ready to lynch the culprit if they got to him before the police. The police? I don't know, it's horrible. I can't believe anyone would do that. I mean, when I found him, he was barely breathing. When I opened the bag, he was flapping his lips like a fish to get air. It's horrible. I think I'll dream about this sight for years to come, said the janitor. The son, seeing how hard it was for his father to talk, decided to change the subject. Now they talked again about his work. However, both of them were only thinking about the baby that had been found in the garbage bag under the bench. A little later, Eric, who was sitting in the office, was finally exhausted and could not realize at what point in time he had lost his temper. He had never been so nervously lost, despite what was happening now. And apparently this situation wasn't just tormenting him, it was driving him crazy. He didn't feel the same. Eric sat in his seat, stood up, walked around the office. Sometimes his head would start to spin again, and he would sit back down. It was hard to admit that he couldn't do anything else with himself. Everything seemed to be falling out of his hands. There was only one desire to take, find, and strangle with his bare hands the man who had stolen his son. He hadn't been home since he found out the child was missing. He's been running around the city looking for leads, interviewing people who might have had something to do with it. It was hard to believe there was no one who saw or knew anything. Even the cameras that had been set up in the cottage village itself hadn't recorded anything suspicious. The whole town was already aware that a child had been found in a garbage bag, but because the information was not firsthand, it was quite distorted, and the more news about the subject, the more distorted the information became. And the news that Eric saw was about an older child. Eric himself didn't even connect the two situations together, but one phone call that ripped through the air made him change his mind. He snapped out of his seat, grabbed the phone, and heard that the child they'd found in the trash bag under the bench was precisely his son. That's right. Is that really my son? Asked Eric, who couldn't believe what was happening, and most of all couldn't believe that his son was alive and well. Yes, we checked everything. He is in the hospital now. I texted you the address, the man said. Don't tell anyone, not the press, not the police, not my wife, Eric said. It wasn't a request, it was a full-fledged order, and he expected it to be obeyed without question. He had his own suspicions. and he needed no one to know anything. For now, everything was in limbo. Eric could not exclude anyone from the circle of suspects. He decided to go to the hospital where his baby was waiting to see him and make sure his baby was alive and well. He called several news publications to get them to throw everyone off the scent. Gave false information because they needed to keep themselves and the baby safe now. Let them say the baby didn't survive, and then the whole situation could be overshadowed by much more aggressive news. Eric had once been in politics, knew well how easy it was to control a population that reacted so violently to any news cause. As he sat in the car, he could feel himself shaking from all of these experiences. Immediately, it felt as if he wasn't the same as he used to be. Before, any excitement didn't touch him. He could take any strain, but now he was disintegrating. His son was his weak point. Who stole his son? Who had put him through this whole nightmare was clearly aware of the situation. Unable to bear his own thoughts, Eric hit the steering wheel with all his might as he pulled up to the hospital building. Immediately, everything inside of him shattered. What if he was too late? What if the baby, who was still alive, was now no longer breathing in some special box? What if he was too late to save his own son? And while he searched for someone to blame, this little babe lay in a bag under the bench, gasping for breath. He got out of the car, and the first thing he did was go to the doctor. He didn't even sit in line, didn't even wait to be called. Just walked in and stared at the gray-haired man who was going through papers with his shoulder, holding the phone. The conversation was clearly very important. The gray-haired man didn't even look at the man who entered, nodded somewhere to the side, apparently to take a seat and wait until he was called and talked to him. "Wipe your glasses," Eric said rather rudely. The hen doctor defiantly exhaled, raised his eyes, and when he saw in front of him, Eric immediately apologized and hummed up. "We'd already know. The baby has been moved to a locked ward, but no one can see him except the people I trust. No information will go anywhere. I can guarantee you that. Come with me," asked the doctor, immediately rising from his seat, realizing that now, more than ever, it was important to make a good impression. "Yes, let's go," said Eric. If it were a normal situation, he would quickly put this man in his place. He would show him where he was wrong, that he should not be spoken to like that. But right now, he was only thinking of his own son. He was escorted down a closed corridor, where no one was around except for a few doctors who probably had access to the ward. All of them pretended as if no one was here, as if a tough businessman hadn't passed through here and gone to see his child, on pain of dismissal and a rather brutal reprisal. None of them would ever say they had been here. "The whole town knows already," the man said. "I take it you've already tried to have the news distorted. I realize all of this is necessary, but you don't have to worry. The worst is over. Your son will be fine. He's well enough to be taken away. We'll keep him here as long as we need to." But the doctor stopped talking. Eric immediately realized that he was just afraid to confess and afraid to say it, which was important. "But what?" Eric asked. "I realize the baby is still too young, but believe me, even at that age you can experience a lot of stress. Your baby has been stressed, and now he's stressed too, because he's still surrounded by the hospital. I realize that this is probably not the best time, but it would be better for the child to be taken somewhere familiar and quiet," said the head doctor. "Give me a couple of hours and I'll come back for him and pick him up." "Is there any way to make sure I don't go through the front door with him?" asked Eric. "Don't worry, we'll arrange it. Just bring the car to the back door. I'll tell you where," said the head doctor, taking Eric under his arm. He led him in the other direction, brought him to the window, showed him where to bring the car, and apparently he was already thinking over in his head a plan of how to realize everything. Eric was distracted when he got the message, looked at his phone and wrinkled his nose. He looked at the head doctor again, then spoke. "I'll stop by tonight, or tomorrow morning. I want to do it at a time when there are as few people as possible to eliminate any chance of being followed." "I'll thank you, don't worry," the man said. The chief physician nodded, leading him in the other direction to go out through another entrance. Really, there was no need for unnecessary rumors right now. The chief physician was not acting for the sake of being thanked financially later for a substantial sum of money. He was only doing it to avoid as much trouble as possible. You shouldn't have gotten involved with Eric. All the more everyone knew that this situation could end in a bad way for the people around him, for the clinic, and for the staff. Eric went outside, immediately called back, talking to someone to bring the child. The person on the other end of the line actively agreed, warned what time it would be better to come. Eric got into the car. He had his suspicions and needed to drive home to get his papers. He felt much calmer now. It felt as if his composure had returned to him. He wasn't nervous anymore. There was no jolt of excitement. His son was alive, was safe. All was well. The press already had other news. Most likely, the man who had wished his son dead was now calmed down. After all, it had been accomplished. When Eric pulled the car up, he didn't drive it into the yard. He only wanted to go in for the documents. But when he entered the apartment, he was very much surprised because he was not prepared for what he saw. There was simply no one here. "Grace," Eric called out. The woman wasn't home. Neither were some of her things, much less a one-bedroom apartment. "No, don't even think about it. I understand, so all right, just do your thing. If she shows up, call me right away. But don't let her see you. You got it?" he asked. She nodded. The housekeeper remained standing, holding the door, as if she was afraid of falling if they let her go. The man flew downstairs. Time was running out, and he didn't want to delay this situation any longer as it was. As Eric drove home, he planned on lying to his wife to tell her it wasn't their baby at all. It was all some kind of duck, but it turned out that when he arrived, she wasn't home at all. And the realization that she might have had something to do with what was going on made him angry. Eric drove to the meeting place, where a detective was waiting for him, and there was no way he was going to sit in one place. Eric knew that this man had only agreed out of respect for him, or maybe out of fear of the consequences. Either way, it was already voluntary, forced, and so it was no wonder he couldn't find a place to sit right now. Eric sat down at the table and pretended that everything was normal. He wanted to show that the most important thing was to stay calm. The detective sat down across from him and put down the folder. Only now Eric noticed that his hands were shaking. "Anyway, I've gathered some information here. It's pretty much the whole package," the detective said. It was hard for him to speak. "That's it, just like I said. Is that Jack?" Eric asked. Eric's first thought was of his biggest competitors, who never used honest methods at all. If anyone in his entourage was to be suspected, it was Jack. This man was very cruel to his competitors. Eric didn't know if he was capable of cruelty to an innocent child. But now the puzzle was coming together in a very different way. "No, I'm sure you don't even know this man. It's Anthony," the detective said, and immediately took one palm of his other hand. Apparently, he was trying to stop the trembling in his hands. "Anthony is the first time I've ever heard that name." "Wait, are you sure?" Eric asked. "I'm sorry, I'm just doing my job. And even though I'm really wary of your reaction, I did my job to the best of my ability," said the detective. And Eric raised his hands conciliatorily. He realized that he was in a hurry to jump to conclusions, and it would be better to hold his tongue now, to let this man talk and finally tell everything he had learned. The detective began to slowly open the folder, exposing the photos of screenshots made from the videos. Still managed, apparently, to find some cameras that were functioning. One thing I can say for sure is that they operated from the inside, because it is unlikely that someone could get into your cottage village without authorization to destroy all the data from the cameras. But this person was unaware that there were backups, said the detective. I managed to get through to the people who had those backups. In return, I had to promise to keep their names confidential. I can guarantee that they had nothing to do with what happened. They're just afraid you might get emotional and take revenge on them too. I need to know everything. I don't understand, he said. Why did you have to steal the baby? What did my baby do that he was condemned to such a cruel death? Eric still didn't understand who the man in question was. And why did this man suddenly think he had any right to dispose of other people's lives? Now, we're going to get to the important stuff. I'm going to give you the whole file, and you're going to read it, preferably within a couple of kilometers of you. I'm sorry, but your temper is legendary, said the detective, shrugging his shoulders. Anyway, this Anthony is your wife's urban lover. I can't prove that they did it together, but I only have circumstantial evidence because they obviously tried to cover it up as best they could. I urge you to read all of this and make only your own decision as to what to do next. There is only circumstantial evidence against your wife. Keep that in mind. When Eric picked up the folder, he was simply dumbfounded by what he saw. Everything in here said that the same Anthony, who was his wife's lover, had indeed stolen the child. There's this gunfight, the screaming. He takes the baby, takes him away, but you can't really see his face. Other cameras. Mask off, kid in the car. That nasty, ugly young face of a man who couldn't even be called an animal after what he'd done. But Eric still didn't understand why this man had stolen his son. The evidence against his wife was indeed circumstantial. Eric looked over it all and didn't know what to do next. Right now, to snap out of his seat, put out an APB on both of them, and then make them regret what they had done. But right now, they needed to get to the hospital in time to pick up the baby, get him to safety, and then decide what to do next. When Eric leafed through the folder to the end, he was 100%. Surely Grace and Anthony had planned this together. He would be sure to catch them by the gills, make them confess, and understand their motives. The man drove to the very entrance of the hospital, picked up the baby, who was loaded into his car and whom he carefully placed in the car cradle. Eric turned around and drove to a completely different exit out of town. After 200+ kilometers, he stopped. It was already dark outside, candles chirping. It was also a cottage community, gated but very different. The neat mansion, which flaunted behind a low fence, seemed to him unusual and somehow not cozy. But the man who lived here was the only one he could trust with his son's life. The lights came on as the guards relayed the information. A tall, thin woman with long gray hair that flew in a braid appeared on the threshold. She wore a long silk black robe with cranes and branches embroidered on it in gold threads. She walked slowly down the steps, came to the gate, pulled it open, and with a thin, bony hand pointed toward the side of the house. Eric said nothing, but when he entered the house, he hugged his mother. He looked a lot like her despite the woman's age. She was clearly trying to maintain herself both externally and internally. She looked like a noble lady, as if she stepped out of the pages of an art history textbook. "Jesus, how tiny is that?" said the woman, admiring the baby. She took him in her arms, and the child immediately stared at her with uncomprehending eyes. "And once you were very small, too. I still remember how you and your brother were." "Mom, there are so many problems now. You're the only person I can trust with my son." The man started talking. "Listen, Eric," she said in a tired voice. "I'm an old woman, you could say old. I'm not going to take care of the child 100% of the time. I'm gonna make sure he's taken care of. He'll have a nanny, a doctor for as long as he needs. I can guarantee you that I can even raise your son and no one will come near him. I'll double the security if I have to. But if you don't want to tell me the reason you brought your child, bypassing his mother, I won't question you." Eric was insanely grateful that she would not interrogate him, would not ask any unnecessary questions. He wanted to go to his friend as soon as possible and agree with him about the plan of revenge and realize it to the fullest. "I really can't tell you anything yet. A little later, when everything is settled, when I'm 100% sure, then I'll tell you everything," Eric said. The mother nodded. The man looked at her and suddenly thought that despite her age, she was still a beautiful, reserved woman. You could see from her that she had a distinctly blue streak in her blood. In her every movement and every word, there was a kind of majestic, special, enviable beauty. "Son, I will never let you offend me. This is your child, my grandson, and I will not let him be harmed. The only thing I need is for you to send trusted men to take charge of guarding the house itself just in case. I trust my guards, but it's a question of who you trust," she said. "Everything will be done." "Don't worry," he replied. Eric kissed his mother on the cheek, kissed his son on the forehead. He just walked out, taking another look at the mansion. The lights were on in the other rooms. Apparently, they would now be preparing a place for the baby to sleep. Eric trusted his mother and knew that if anything happened to him, his child would always be looked after and always protected. Eric wasn't going home, he was going to his friend's house. Dylan was the only person who could get involved in this whole plan and be helpful. Eric wasn't about to jump in head first. It needed to be well planned because there was a risk that the guilty parties could be missed too easily. When Eric arrived, Dylan, having received a call from him, was tired and looked out the window. He saw his friend. Going downstairs, he opened the intercom. Eric went up to the apartment. Only now he saw that the intercom handle was turned. Apparently his friend was waiting for the handyman. Dylan nodded when he saw the direction of Eric's gaze. "Yesterday the handymen were bringing in the closet and broke the hell out of my intercom. I don't know how they did it. The handymen won't be here until this week. I'm sorry, I just woke up. I'm not thinking straight," Dylan said, putting the kettle on. He wanted to drink coffee, because it was impossible to wake up without coffee. Dylan looked up and saw that it was 4 o'clock on the clock. Dylan, I know you can say no, that you don't want to get involved in all this mess, but believe me, I can't do it without you. You're the only person I trust, and you're the only person who will keep this a secret, even if this whole story ends badly, Eric said. Dylan was aware of the story with the baby and understood how important it was to keep it all secret now. The first thing Eric did was to call Dylan and tell him that the baby was safe and that Eric would take him to a safe place. So now it was foolish to expect the situation to be any different. Dylan realized that if Eric had arrived, it meant that he had found the culprits and would now want revenge. And considering that Eric had originally wanted to go up against Jack, Dylan was ready to refuse, even if their friendship would be jeopardized. I hired a detective. You know, it turns out my baby was stolen by some Anthony. You dig a little deeper, and it turns out he's my wife's lover. My wife is no longer at home. She packed up and left the same day. When I found out about her having a lover, the evidence against her is circumstantial, against him 100%. But when I read all the papers, I'm sure she's just as guilty as him. I have to get back at them, you know. You do, Eric said. Do you have any plan? Dylan asked. I'm going to have a real blood hunt for my baby. If you're ready to come with me, I'll be glad. If you're not, I understand. And believe me, our friendship won't be damaged, Eric said. I'll go with you, you don't have to worry. But I don't understand why you had to steal the baby. You could have packed your things and gone away with your lover. Why all of a sudden make a circus out of it? It's a miracle your son survived. So they originally expected that the baby would not survive. Dylan asked, trying to clarify the situation for himself. That's what I want to know, said Eric. In an hour they had already gathered. He had already been informed about the whereabouts of his wife and lover, who surprisingly enough were together. That was even a good thing. And Eric, after checking to make sure everything was in the trunk, hit the road. They drove up to the village where his wife and her lover were hiding. Anthony and Grace, apparently trying to hide, had chosen a village that was almost the most remote. If only they had known that this would obviously not play to their advantage, they would have settled in the busiest part of town. Not 20 minutes later, Eric threw first the bound Anthony and then his wife into the trunk. Anthony and then his wife. They simply stormed into the house, pointed guns at them, tied them up, gagged them, and pulled bags over their heads. It all went much faster than Eric had counted on, especially since he had actually expected a pretty solid fight back. When they got back in the car, Eric was adamant. He was taking his hunting lodge to a place where no one else would go, where no one would find them. He already had a specific revenge plan in his head that these two would remember for the rest of their lives. If they managed to survive it all, when they pulled up, Eric pulled both prisoners out of the open trunk and dragged them into the house. Dylan helped him, but without much interest. Apparently, he had come here only to find out the truth, and then he would decide whether he wanted to be a part of this or not. Eric, what the hell? Grace yelled. She had a pall over her face. She was sobbing, and it was noticeable that because of the fast driving and broken roads, she had hit her face quite painfully, the brown stain already showing through the bag. What the hell? You asked me. What the hell? Why don't you tell me what your plan was? Eric said. Eric, taking the gun and placing it in his lap, sat down on a high, roughly craggy table. It looked more like some kind of hunter's throne. It looked imposing and threatening. And Eric himself looked like a dangerous man, especially since he had a reputation for being able to shoot anyone he didn't like, and he would get absolutely nothing for it. Anthony, who was now looking at his mistress and her husband, glanced around nervously. Dylan had removed the bags from their heads and the dim light was making them squint unaccustomedly. All right, my children, Eric said. I'm an adult uncle, and I'll tell you right away, you have only two choices. You don't tell me anything. You pretend you had nothing to do with it, even though I have all the evidence you need to prove your guilt. Then I'll just blow your brains all over the house. I'll dump them where they dump all the carcasses. And that'll be the end of this conversation. Or there's a second option, where you tell me everything in detail. And then I'll give you a chance to survive, even with what you've done. It's your choice. There was silence. There was a rather ghastly odor in the house, skins, slaughtered animals, caked blood on the huge table. It all looked like a horror movie. And Anthony, who was far more frightened than Grace, started to say. She was the one who'd made it all up. It was her plan, shouted Anthony. Shut up. If you don't shut up now, I'm going to tear you to shreds myself. Grace shouted, turning to her lover, clearly not sure how to get him to shut up. This way they had at least a chance. And if it continued now, Grace was sure her husband would rip her head off right here and now. I'm not gonna shut up. You heard me. If we don't tell him now, he's gonna shoot us here. Look, I fell in love with her. I didn't even know she was your wife. She told me later that things were bad, that you were going through a divorce. In a shaky voice, Anthony said, I really didn't know anything. I fell in love like a boy. I'd do anything for her. Even kill the baby. Eric asked, trying to hold back his hatred for the man. I wanted to raise the gun right now, to make him regret what he had done, even for a second. Eric wanted to know the truth. Dylan stood at the door jamb, occasionally glancing at his friend, but when he learned the whole story, he was already unconditionally going to help Eric get revenge. No, you weren't. No, she'd come up with a plan to get the baby taken away. Make it look like a robbery, and then find someone to buy the baby. First she said we'd get the ransom, then we'd sell the baby and use the proceeds to move away. There was no mention of murder. I left the baby in the apartment. Grace came, she took him and left. I didn't even know she was capable of something like that. Anthony screamed. And Eric knew that Anthony was telling the truth, because only Eric's wife could be traced back to the place where the infant had been found by the cameras. Anthony wasn't even close. But the fact that Anthony, after finding out, still chose to keep everything a secret and still left with Grace made him just as much of a criminal as she was. You would never let me go because of the baby. I didn't want to live in that golden cage anymore. I wanted a normal life. The baby had crippled my life. I couldn't take it anymore. She screamed. A golden cage. No one's ever been held anywhere before you. You always got everything you asked for. You could have left the baby to the nanny and gone on with your life. No one was holding you. You could have gotten a divorce and gone to the end of the world with your damn lover. Eric shouted every word. He wanted to scream so she could hear him better. But he knew that if he did, he'd lose his temper, and that could end badly. I hate you. I hate this baby. I only got involved with you for the money, and you thought you could keep me with the baby? All that screaming sounded like the ravings of a madman. Eric sat and looked at his wife and realized that this was the same man who had put his child in a garbage bag, tied it up, and thrown it under the bench. Eric just couldn't find a place to go. He asked his friend to help. He threw them both down into the basement. In the meantime, he thought about how he could make things happen faster. He consulted with his friend and heard Grace screaming downstairs. Anthony asked for help, but no one here would hear them. What the hell were you all babbling about? Grace shouted, turning to her lover. He only says he's so brave. He wouldn't do anything to us. I'm not going to put that to the test. This is all your fault. I shouldn't have listened to you. I should have just run away from you and never seen you again. Anthony shouted back. Dylan grinned as he heard this conversation, which even now seemed silly to him. These people only cared about getting killed, but didn't care about what they had done to a living child, leaving him no chance to survive. By the time Eric and Dylan had already talked things over, they were getting ready to exact their revenge. Grace and Anthony had already gone quiet. Occasional outbursts were heard, but nothing else. Grace sat against the damp earthen wall of the basement. Her eyes had already gotten used to the darkness. She could see the silhouette of her lover, and she must have thought she had chosen the wrong man, especially considering that these thoughts had come to mind just hours before the end. After what she had done, the young woman was sure her husband would not forgive her for it and would never let her go alive, especially after she had given herself away with her own behavior. Is this really how it's going to end? Anthony asked. Grace felt sorry for him. He was a young innocent, just very gullible. No wonder he felt sorry for him. I should never have listened to you. God, why did I listen to you in the first place? He asked. His question was rather rhetorical. I could hear the bitterness and pain in his voice, and it was clear that he could hardly stand the heat of passion. How could you do otherwise? You love me. How could you say no to me? Grace asked. She felt her face stretch into a smile. I could have. Not just could have. I should have turned you down. I can't believe my eyes and ears. They're gonna shoot us down here like stray dogs. Why did I ever decide to take that baby? I can't believe I'm just a toy for your crazy husband now, Anthony said. Footsteps were heard somewhere upstairs. The people who had been on the first floor, they must have gone back up. There was some noise, some scraping. Someone was talking. It was hard to make out from the voice whether it was Dylan or Eric speaking. Their voices were low, heavy, very similar to each other. Even Grace, who had lived with her husband for so many years, looked up and couldn't tell who exactly she was hearing. She was already preparing herself for the fact that she would never see the white light again, that her death would likely be an agonizing one. Why had she really gotten it into her head that he wouldn't let her go because of the baby? Why did she go to him to confess? She could have just gone to him and told him she couldn't take it anymore, that she wanted to live with her lover. She could have told him she never loved her child. She could have just asked him to leave her alone. And if that didn't work, then she could have done the worst. She just took the risk. And now it was unlikely she'd ever see the light of day again. After all, they'd almost escaped. In just a couple hours, someone was supposed to come to pick them up and take them to safety. Not in time, just a few hours. A bright light appeared. Someone had opened a hatch and beams burst into the basement. Some strange silhouette loomed over the open hatch, huge hide horns. You couldn't even tell if it was a man or a beast. It was shaking its head like a wild man. "Well, is it time?" said the silhouette. He grabbed Anthony by the scruff of the neck first, pulled him outside. "God, please, please don't. I'm begging you," squealed the boy who couldn't take the heat. He couldn't believe this was going to happen right now. Too late. You should have said that to yourself when you were trying to steal someone else's baby, repeated the silhouette. Then that silhouette pulled Grace out, and the two of them dragged both of them. They dragged them along branches that scratched their skin, leaving deep wounds. Grace was squealing, screaming, begging for help. Anthony, on the other hand, was already quiet. Apparently, he had already lost all hope of rescue. The men who were dragging them ahead of them bore little resemblance to Dylan and Eric. It seemed that they were even taller than their prototypes. Like ancient spirits, more like the ultimate nightmare. Huge, with branching horns, strange skeletal beast masks. Huge hides were thrown on them, which were even more powerful and gave them a rather creepy look. "Well, if you have no human qualities, then you will live by beast qualities," said the voice. "And there is no place among beasts," said another. The voices were already thickening, dusk around them. Now that Grace and Anthony's eyes were accustomed to the light, they realized for the first time that they were likely to be left in the woods all night. Grace, who had been in very frequent communication with her husband before about hunting, knew that there were a great many wild and dangerous beasts roaming about. Her husband often shot either stray deer or boars. One day he even came in with a huge wound on his shoulder from a blow from a bear, which has now healed into a scar. "Drop it. You don't need to babysit them," said the man. Immediately the two culprits fell backwards onto the rotten grass. They were still shaking with fear. Apparently, it was extremely hard to realize that there was no other way out. Grace, who all this time had held tightly to the last, had hoped that nothing would befall her. Now she realized that revenge would come upon them both. "Eric, please, I'm begging you, please," she prayed. "And my son also asked you. He also asked you not to put him in a bag to suffocate him there," asked the largest silhouette with a skull on his head. Suddenly something was poured on Grace and Anthony. The violent stinking liquid ran down their heads, over their skin, poured into their ears, nose, mouth. The smell was so nauseating that they both wanted to clamp their noses shut, except their hands were still tied. Grace knew immediately from the smell that it was the blood of some beast. She was already realizing what vengeance awaited them, and for the first time in a long time she thought that it was too cruel, that she didn't deserve it. "It's not right. It's murder," Grace screamed, trying to appeal to her conscience. "Please, I'll do anything." "You said we'd have a chance," Anthony said. "Yes, I did. Yes, I always keep my promises," the man said, straightening up. Grace looked at her husband, whom she recognized from his voice, but she didn't recognize him outwardly at all. Sometimes it seemed to her that the two creepy creatures had nothing to do with her husband and his friend at all. It seemed as if these creatures were called here to punish her. These thoughts made her think that she was already going crazy. Apparently, she couldn't survive all the stress in the zone of fear for what lay ahead. She turned to her lover, who was sobbing like a child. Grace took advantage of the silence and began to frantically look around. She was already looking for an opportunity to escape, or at least find a tentative escape route. But there wasn't a single bright ray anywhere, which meant the edge of the forest was far away. She even tried to find some kind of trail. From where they had been dragged, if she went out to her husband's cabin, she might be able to find a way out of the woods along the trail. But it turned out to be far from that simple. There were no tracks, They must have cleaned up all the tracks before stripping them of their blindfolds. I could shoot you right there. But I didn't, because I promised. And now the only thing I'm asking you to do is move faster. I'll leave you here. I'll take a few shots. If I don't hit, you still have one chance to survive. And if I do, I'll bet you like a wild animal, he said. Either way, if he doesn't get hit, I will, said another voice. If by some miracle the two of you are still alive and well, you're going to be out of the woods, considering how much blood you're covered in. It's all right, we'll see. Maybe the animals won't be out hunting tonight. Maybe they'll all be fed up and you won't attract their attention, Eric said. Anthony could already feel the full-fledged flight of those images of beasts in huge skins that stood before him on two legs, the serenity of his mistress, the vast forest he was completely unaware of. All this drove him to a frenzy, and he could not bring himself to inspire any supposed calmness. Anthony screamed, cried, begged to be rescued, but nothing came of it. No one would save him, especially now that justice is about to be served. Well, let's just say the hunt is on, Eric said. He walked over, turned them both on their backs, cut the ropes, and then began to count loudly from 10 to 1. Both prisoners jumped, but to Eric's disappointment, they ran in the same direction. Apparently, Anthony was relying on the experience of Grace, who looked quite calm. In fact, Grace by this time felt like she was going crazy and couldn't trust her own memories of the forest. When Eric counted to 1, he fired first into the air, then towards them. He wasn't even aiming. He wasn't going to resemble them, and he wasn't going to shoot them for real. Let nature itself decide if they were worth living or not. Eric was still looking in the direction where the two silhouettes could be seen. He was both sure that he would see them alive, and at the same time he thought that maybe they would get lucky and get mauled by a bear. Time to get back to the car, Dylan said, removing the skulls from himself. He realized how cruel this punishment had been, but it was clearly worth it. Even if the two of them ever got out of the woods, they would never be able to get rid of the horrible memories of what had happened. Yes, it's time, said Eric, who was thinking the same thing. Even if by some miracle they got out of the forest, they would never be mentally healthy again. Eric turned around and went first to the right, and from the outside it looked like he was going into the middle of nowhere. But Eric knew this part of the forest too well, so it was no wonder that in a few minutes they came to the cabin. From there they reached the edge of the forest and got into the car. Eric felt the hatred in him completely fade away. He felt that he had finally gotten his revenge. Even though he wanted to shoot them first, he didn't want to be like them. He would not take their lives with his own hands. If someone from above deemed them worthy to live on, then let them live. But they would always remember such a punishment. When both men were already in the car, they did not talk about what had happened. They just sat there, staring at the edge of the forest in front of them. It seemed as if the two captives were about to jump right out to meet them. Eric, who was sitting behind the wheel, still believed and hoped that someone from above would keep them from getting out. He didn't want them to get out. He wanted this forest to take them forever. No one would even turn up their noses afterward. No one would look for them. And besides, there'd be another trial waiting for them now, and they'd be in jail for child abuse. Okay, we should go home, Dylan said. A voice broke the silence. Eric looked at him. For a moment, Dylan seemed alien to him. It felt strange. They drove first onto a broken road, then onto the highway. When Eric drove Dylan back to his house, they were still didn't talk about anything. It wasn't until Dylan was about to get out that he finally spoke. It's done. You promised that if they got out of there, you wouldn't lose anything else, Dylan said. I always keep my promises. You saw that. I didn't even shoot them. If I wanted to, I would have shot them both. I gave them a chance. Let them see for themselves how lucky they are, especially since Grace knows I never miss. It's a sign to her that I gave them a chance, a man said. Dylan nodded. He still hadn't gotten out of the car. Apparently, he wanted to talk about something else, but either he didn't have the courage or his fatigue was taking its toll. What do you plan to do next? Dylan asked his friend. Honestly, I don't know. First of all, I'll go and get the kid. I'll talk to the mother. Maybe she'll give me some advice. Although, I don't think it's worth changing your life. To be honest, I, on the contrary, would do everything to make my child grow up in his own home, in peace, and there would be no hysterical girl who is ready to put him in a bag at any moment, said the man. Dylan said goodbye to his friend, left him in the car, got out and walked towards his apartment building. He thought a lot about what they had done. He didn't want to contemplate what might have happened that night. If Grace and Anthony were very lucky, they could be on the edge of the woods by morning. But if they were unlucky, no one would ever see them again. Meanwhile, Grace was racing through the woods. She ran like a mad woman, using her hands to pull apart the branches that clung to her skin. It seemed as if the forest itself wanted to hold her back. "Grace, wait, I can't make it," Anthony shouted. Grace answered him nothing. She was saving her strength. She had to save it. If she started yelling back at him now, she might not have the strength to still run. Not turning around, hoping that no beast had taken them into account yet. Oh, and besides, as long as she ran ahead, she had a chance. If any beast was chasing them, Anthony would go first, giving her a chance to escape faster. She carried on through the woods, stepping over logs. Branches that crunched or underfoot got in the way. Occasionally she would fall, elbows hurting or skinning parts of her body, but she would still get up and keep running. She wouldn't have the energy for this. "Grace!" shouted Anthony. She wasn't going to stop. The only voice in her head was her own, telling her that she had an obligation to run now. She saw a beam ahead and didn't immediately realize how long they had been running. By the time she spotted the saving light, she was already stopping, walking, running again. It felt like sand had been poured into her feet. It was impossible to move. It was as if lead weights were strapped to her feet, but she forced herself to walk, to crawl toward that light. Anthony, who had already lost all possibility of reaching her, of shouting, was silent. And then, with a final effort, she ran out of the woods and into the road. Grace could not remember on which side of the forest the road ran. Much later, to her horror, she would realize that they had made a huge detour, and that if they had run in the right direction, they would have reached the road in just a few hours. Grace pulled onto the road when she saw a car. The woman behind the wheel was singing along to a familiar song on the radio. But then a silhouette appeared in front of her on the road, a flushed, skinned young woman drenched in some kind of brown liquid. The woman screamed and slammed on the brakes. That may have been Grace and Anthony's salvation. Eric sat at his mother's house. He didn't like this house. Somehow this house was foreign, unfamiliar, not real. It seemed impossible to live here. It was more of a museum than a home. Ever since he was a kid, he wasn't allowed to touch anything here. He spent most of his time either in the stables or outside, only if he could get his mother to finally get away from all the endless teacher training. Even though it had been so long, he still didn't like this house. When he grew up, when he stopped depending on his mother, he no longer hid his attitude towards her upbringing. However, Eric's mother was the kind of person who never saw her mistakes. She believed that she was right and that Eric's character was entirely her merit. Eric sat at the table, talking about everything that had happened, everything he had done out there in the woods, without fear of his mother judging him. "I should have shot them both. In the days of my youth, we would have tied them to the basement here. No one would have helped them, even if they heard, and they would have starved to death. It would be better to do the same thing to them as they did to our boy. Put bags on their heads and let them suffer," said the old woman. When she said such cruel things, not a single muscle on her face did not tremble. She spoke calmly and reservedly. Apparently, the situation did not shock her at all. Eric knew his mother's character well enough to know that she would not judge him. The woman took out a long cigar, lit it, and looked at her son carefully. "You have a much gentler character than me and a much heavier one than your father. You've taken only the best from us. And believe me, I would never condemn you even if you had slaughtered those creatures out there. I always felt sorry for the animals you shot. I've always felt sorry for every deer, every boar you or your father dragged into that house. But if you had killed those people there, I wouldn't have said a word to you," said the woman. "I don't think I want to take that kind of sin on my soul." "Well, what's done is done, and whoever's on top will get out of there," Eric said. The old woman, giving off a dense fog of smoke, looked at her son. She had some strange images in her head. She hesitated for a moment. Then her gaze became calm. Apparently, she imagined what she would do to Grace. "When you brought that girl, I told you right away that she wasn't our blood, that she wouldn't fit in here. But when my grandson came along, I forgave her everything." "As you can see, you didn't have to forgive anything," the woman said. "But you're right. What's done is done. The main thing is that our baby is alive. He's fine, so you can either take him or leave him to me. I'm raising him to be as fine a person as I raised you, but I know you don't like my parenting, so you're gonna take him home." "I'm sorry, Mom. But yes, I will take my son. I'd be happy for you to come visit us sometimes, or I'll bring him to you. I hope this whole situation never comes up in his mind, Eric said. A few hours later, when their conversation was over, he had put his son in the bassinet, secured it in the car, and now just watched his little sleeping baby just sniffling softly. Eric got behind the wheel. His mother walked over to the window, placed her palm so that he couldn't close it. Look, Eric, I think you should move here. I'm getting really old. Age takes its toll. If you don't come after I die, promise me you'll find someone to keep taking care of the house. I'll leave this house to my grandson. I want this house to be in perfect condition even after I die, she said. Mom, come on, you've got your whole life ahead of you, Eric said with a smile. But your house will be in pristine condition. You don't have to worry. She smiled slightly, stepped away from the car. Eric heard it not for the first time. His mother said it every time he drove away. Sometimes Eric thought about the fact that maybe she was sick, hadn't told him about it, and that's why she was so sure she'd be gone soon. But if he were Eric, he'd tear the damn house down altogether, raze it to the ground. He wouldn't want to see it, wouldn't want to leave it to his son. It was like a graveyard of memories. An old mansion, not yet forgotten. Who knows how many generations had been raised here and how many deaths had occurred behind these walls. As Eric drove away, he forced himself not to think about this house because he didn't want to think about anything bad anymore. He was driving home with his son. The baby was happy, healthy, and most importantly alive. But the most important thing was that there was no woman around who could hurt him again. Eric suddenly thought that if the captors had run in the right direction, they would have reached the road in a couple of hours. Why had he put them so close to the rescue site? He didn't know the answer to that question himself. Perhaps he didn't want to be a murderer after all. He turned onto the main highway and drove home. A few more hours and he would be home, where the nanny was waiting and where the baby would be truly happy. Eric forbade himself to think about his ex-wife, especially when they would be divorced very soon without her involvement. The arm that stretched from the plane to the airport entrance was filled with people. The little boy, who was already sitting on his father's lap, regarded each person. This was his second airplane ride, and every time he almost danced with happiness, because he liked very much to watch how everyone around him was in a hurry, running somewhere, wanting to be on the street as soon as possible. The boy himself, as it seemed to him, was ready to sit here for 24 hours until everyone looked, touched, and looked through every porthole. Dad, why are they all standing in line? Asked the little boy, turning back to his father. Eric smiled. They're probably afraid they won't be able to get out in time and the plane will run away, Eric said. He had a strange look on his face. He missed them. The little boy laughed. It was their first vacation together, and Eric was happy that this time he had decided to take his son with him. Of course, when they took off for the first time, little Tom was very scared, but then he kept asking when they would be on an airplane again. Are we going home now? Asked the boy. Yes, we are going home. We'll wait until everyone gets off, and then you and I will go. Then we'll get our suitcase. We'll go out, a car will meet us, you and I will come home, order your favorite food. We'll sit on the floor by the TV, watch cartoons and eat, Eric said. Yay, shouted the boy, raising both hands in the air. Eric was really tired. The flight had been harder on him because he hadn't slept for more than 24 hours because of his work, and even though he had promised his son that they would spend time together, all he wanted to do was sleep. He even asked for a driver to pick them up. They just brought the car around. Eric was trivially afraid of falling asleep at the wheel while they waited for the luggage. The man had taken a large glass of coffee and was now watching when their dark green suitcase with white palm trees finally showed up on the conveyor belt. Daddy's our suitcase, the little boy shouted out, pointing in the direction of indeed their suitcase. Eric nodded. He walked closer and pulled it off the conveyor belt. They walked outside where a black car was already parked. Eric got into the back seat, putting his son in the child seat. He didn't notice how he passed out almost immediately. He had a blissful sense of calm, as if they would finally get home and everything would be over. The toddler went on and on telling the driver, who he knew well, how wonderful their vacation had been, how they had swum in the ocean, how they had watched the different fish at the dolphinarium. Eric woke up to the baby jostling him with his tiny fist. The man looked around, finally realized that they had arrived and it was time to wake up and get out of the car. Just then the babysitter came out and arrived just in time. The young pretty woman immediately hugged the boy, who ran out to meet her. Now he was telling her about his trip. "Eric, you got a call. I told them you were on a plane," the housekeeper said as she followed her out. "Okay, I'll dial it. Automatic," Eric said. Though he didn't even ask who had called him or what for, he was so sleepy, so tired, he was almost out of it. "Daddy, go to sleep. I'll wait," said the little boy. "And GZ and I will go make a milkshake." Eric was very grateful to his son and really went to take a nap for at least a couple of hours. Lately, he was having a hard time coping with all the responsibilities he had taken on. Despite the enormous amount of work he had to do, Eric wished his son didn't need his father's attention like he once did, so he just tried to spend as much time with him as possible. It's been a few years since that horrible day when the baby was found in a bag, and in that time, Eric had changed too much in his life. He found that Janitor, gave him a nice apartment, provided for him for the rest of his life. Plus, he never got back together with his ex-girlfriend, since they were divorced without her presence. But Eric knew she survived. He'd seen Anthony working as a loader, and when he saw his executioner, he'd stormed out of the building like a stung man. Eric wanted nothing more than to be left alone. The press quickly died down and no one cared how the old janitor had found the surprise package under the bench. Eric himself tried not to remember the situation, but every now and then it still shot through his mind that he could have been left without his favorite son just because his wife suddenly decided she had the right to order his life. Eric spent the evening with his son, watching cartoons, eating and drinking milkshakes, laughing, talking a lot. The little boy was happy that his daddy was spending time with him. Eric only called back the number when he had gotten a good night's sleep. He was happy to hear from his friend who had just returned from abroad. He wanted to see him. Eric was happy to be able to hug Dylan again, to shake his hand, and just be with the man he trusted unconditionally. But Dylan himself sounded rather strange. He wanted to meet. Eric invited him over to his place. When Dylan arrived, he brought with him a big stuffed toy. And the little boy, when he saw his favorite hero, was madly excited. He hugged his godfather. He was just glad when the nanny had already taken the baby away. Dylan was left alone with his friend. They went up to the study where they could finally talk in peace. Dylan looked like a man worried about something. "I can see that something's bothering you. I hope it's nothing serious," Eric asked. "In fact, I just have a lot of problems, but all of them are quite solvable." "Don't think so. I look so simple because I'm very tired. Can I have some coffee?" Dylan asked. Eric nodded, gave a wave in after her while they brought a tray with sweets and strong coffee. Dylan took a few sips first. He still looked focused, a little confused and bewildered. Either he was trying to confess something, or hell knows. But Eric was getting worried. "Your ex-wife showed up. I understand she tried to get through to you first, but when she couldn't, she tried my ex-wife. I'd already had such a big fight with Lily. She wasn't gonna tell me anything. Although when she found out about the whole situation, she couldn't stay away. Anyway, she got in touch with my ex-wife through some acquaintance, and she passed the information to me," Dylan said. "What does she want?" "She's making threats again," Eric asked. He didn't expect anything else but empty threats, which his ex-wife was generous with. To be honest, Eric was quite upset when he realized that she had survived after all.